Hi everyone, thanks for coming along to my session. This is the CIO Cybersecurity Playbook. I'm Craig Lawson, I'm one of the Gartner analysts here, and unfortunately I happen to be a card-carrying security pest, so don't hold that against me too much, but thanks again for your time. And so if we look at, there's always been this sort of ongoing friction between a CISO and a CIO, I guess, and I'm not sure we're going to solve world hunger at the moment, but it's interesting sort of to compare and contrast the priorities of the two, just to try and see how we can better align them. And so a CISO's job is we kind of start with, hey, I don't want to get hacked, and then everything else sort of goes down to balancing protection needs and managing the cost of cybersecurity and all of that. CISO kind of come at this from a different angle, and that they've got to deliver, service delivery. How do you get good value out of IT? How do you make sure that that's making the business more agile? Oh, and then at the end of that, let's not get hacked while we're doing it. I saw this really interesting sort of bookends, the same content in the middle, but it's the extremes at the edges that's a bit different. And so to try and work through this, we've got a framework of sorts, and this is what we're talking about with the playbooks. And so these are all, interesting subcomponents of a cybersecurity program. And so where do we start? There's a lot going on in a lot of different areas of IT, including cybersecurity, but systematically, what could that look like? What's a good way to think about what we need to be doing? And that's what this framework helps with. And one important point is there's some parts where a CIO, you'll be the leader, and there's other parts where you're a peer. And so it's not like each one of these you need to own every single thing, but I think as a list of what to do directionally for our cybersecurity program, this isn't a bad framework to look at. And this is what I'll be using today and going through specific examples of that during today's session. So that's the what we need to be doing. This is kind of the how do we go about doing that. And so I'm down in the weeds. I live and work in security operations and threat intelligence and vulnerability management and all that type of stuff. So I like to be very detail orientated. And so these are the types of things that functionally you'll be putting into place to meet those what. Things like, we use this term a lot in cybersecurity around people, process and technologies. How are you using the people, the processes that you need to run, and the technologies that underpin both to deliver those types of cybersecurity outcomes. And so we've got some data for you that was interesting. I kind of enjoyed working on this slide deck, preparing it for this session. It wasn't my slides, I need to say that, but I thought this was really interesting to ask a CIO and a CISO the same question and look at the answers that they gave. And so this could be either amusing or not, depending on your perspective. And so this one was around, what does the reporting structure look like? So that seems to be a common question. Does the CISO have to report into the CIO, or do they report somewhere else inside that organisation? For me personally, I don't really have a horse in this race. I'm more focused on the outcome, and if it works better for you that the CISO reports into the CIO, great. If they report somewhere else, well, that can be great too. But when surveying these specific roles, I thought it was interesting that a lot of CISOs here think that they should be reporting outside of the CIO, and a lot of the CISOs that are reporting into the CIO thought that they should be reporting outside of the CIO. So there's a lot of CISOs don't think that they should be reporting to the CIO. I pulled out a calculator prior to this presentation because I'm a bit of a dummy like that. It's about 82% of CISOs think that they should be reporting outside of the CIO. This one is funny because it seems like about 65% of CIOs happen to agree with them. So what does that say about CISOs, right? They want a bit of autonomy there, and it sounds to me like CIOs are happy to give it to them. But these are just directionally sort of interesting data points to think about what this looks like inside your own organisation. This one was one of the more interesting data points for me. Is, again, I work in security operations, and so things like, patching comes up a lot in my calls. We've spent about 7 or 8 years working on some evidence-based first principles thinking research, which I'm just starting to roll out now on this. And if from your point of view as a CIO, it feels a little bit sometimes like security is telling you the sky is falling all the time, it turns out you're right. So here's some data points here just to underpin this. For about the last 15 years since 2006, it's only about roughly 9% of vulnerabilities in a calendar year that go on and get exploited in the wild. It's a statistically small number, and it's been flat for about 15 years. And the only reason we're seeing it increase is there's been a higher aggregate increase in vulnerabilities, not a bigger increase in the number of vulnerabilities being exploited by threat actors. So that means something like 90% of vulnerabilities don't get exploited in the wild. And so you think about how we build our patching programs. Isn't that interesting in terms of how we're prioritising things? I also like to make a point that there's 3 really valid reasons that we'll never out-patch threat actors at scale. And these are 3 reasons that a lot of people in cybersecurity, I think, annoy people in IT a lot. One is patches break things all the time. That happens a lot, right? And patches also aren't available. There's thousands of vulnerabilities a year that don't get patches. I mean, what do we want people in IT to do about that? Start patching software they're paying maintenance for? And then you've got another problem. I have a lot of empathy with people in IT over, I call it the cohabitation problem. And if you take, we tend to deal and look at patching as a binary thing. My vulnerability scanner found a vulnerability, therefore you should go and install that patch and you've got 14 days to do it. Pretty typical, right? Well, what if it's something like Java? Java has its own issues and all of that, but you guys could go and patch Java tomorrow. You've got tools that can patch at scale, but you can't patch Java, right? You've got 5 other vendors who need to issue individual patches separately that you need to install before you can circle back and patch Java. And so these are areas of analytics I think that we really can improve on, but isn't this interesting? Look at the friction between the blue is CISOs when they're reporting into the CIO and when they're reporting outside of the CIO. Big delta gaps. That to me isn't good. And again, I'm sort of a threat type of guy. I want to start with whatever we do, the first principle should be, our goal should be to make it really hard for threat actors. Right? I want them to come through a swamp and then hit a barbed wire fence, right? That's the way I'm built. And anything that's not aligned with that, I'm not interested. It's superfluous to the mission. And so whenever you've got this situation where internal teams are tearing themselves apart with friction, right? How long can you go back and look at any military historian, a country divided will always fall, all of that sort of stuff. Those principles exactly apply today. So these are one of these things that I think are worth thinking about deeply in terms of the disconnect. And I think there's a case to answer for us in security how we could be doing a better job in helping you as well. Also with the roles and the structure can be really important. Who is owning what? Where the accountability and the decisions are made. And not that I'll ever be a manager, but if I was, my wife says, should I go into management? She said, no, you can't even manage yourself. How are you supposed to manage other people? So probably not. But I think one of the things you want to aim for is, am I giving these people the tools they need to do the job? Right? That could be a lot of different things in terms from work conditions and everything else. And then the second thing I think you need to do concurrently well, which is hard, is get out of their way. And so these are the things that you want to do, is this is a team effort. You want to empower the teams to do the absolute best they can and then get out of their way while they're making these decisions. So this is a really important role that I think a CIO is critical at doing. Here's an example org chart. This is sort of one of the styles where if you had a situation where the CISOs are reporting outside of the CIO, it would kind of look like this. There's another example where you could have IT security operations reporting into the CISO or some kind of hybrid model. So there's different ways to think this. I don't think there's a right way. This isn't saying that this is the way you have to do it. But if you did, this would be the type of model that we typically see. On the plus side, I'm in this group here doing pen testing and vulnerability assessment and all of that. So if nothing else for the CIOs in the audience, you get all the good toys. CISOs get to do policy assurance and compliance. All right. I'm a heavily data-driven type of guy, right? And one of the tools we brought out recently, which I'm a little bit of a fan of, is that we have these benchmarking tools inside there. And so we get a lot of questions on how do you think objectively we're doing, and then how would that compare to what everyone else is doing? And so this is, I think, a healthy exercise rather than sort of working in a bubble. Can I stick my head above the parapet and look around and just do a bit of a health check on where we think we're at? And so this is a self-servicing benchmark where you can go in and do your own benchmarking. And we've got 25 different areas that you can do that with. And so these all help. I was talking before about this is the what to do with the scaffolding and that rough framework, and then the how to do it. Well, if you want to figure out how the how is going, this is one of those ways. And so there's thousands of clients a year that use this. And so what that ends up looking like is you get these nice benchmarking results on how you're going. Again, it's not perfect, there's no silver bullets here, but it's good to know how you think you're tracking versus how you're actually tracking, and how can we make course corrections. This isn't something you're going to fill out every week. I would probably suggest something like quarterly or half yearly or something like that would be a good cadence. But that's good, right? How are we actually tracking versus my peers? And so one of the areas I do cover is things like threat intelligence, and I think this is important because we do too much static and non-evidence-based compliance frameworks in cybersecurity. Everyone gets the same oven mitt. And whether you're in manufacturing or retail or banking or other verticals, I'm going to point out the obvious, is you have a threat landscape, they're different. Right? And you make a population healthier by treating the individual patient. Wouldn't it be crazy if we all went to the doctor and said, hey doc, I'm not feeling well, and we all got an aspirin, right? You didn't ask you to step on the scales and the doctor tell you you've been eating too many pies, Lawson, or your blood pressure's high or whatever it happens to be. You would expect these level of diagnostics because the output of that actually is a credible input into the security program that your critical role is in helping us put it together. And so this is an age-old question as well, is security versus the business. And seems to me here, looking at this with these questions around what's the trade-off between cybersecurity protection and business growth? Is cybersecurity acting like a brakes in the car, which means you can go faster, or are we a handbrake slowing you down? Is it primarily a business outcome? What's the priority of generative AI adoption, safety versus functionality? And it seems really interesting here that the CISOs that were responding were all overcompensating is the wrong word, but they were very much leaning towards these are all business-driven functions, where the CIO seems to have a more balanced perspective on it. And when you do these things, you don't want to predicate the answer, but I found this really interesting, that out of the survey respondents, the CISOs tended to lean more towards the business than they did security. And so this is another framework example. This is another one I'm very big on, is on resilience. There's no such thing as perfect security, but what we can do is try and become a lot more resilient to cyber threats. And so, I do a lot of work in this space, and so this would be an example of tracking emerging trends and threats. And so if you don't know this, there's about, depending on who you talk to, depending which threat intelligence vendor you're talking to on the day, but they're all tracking about between 180 and 300 threat actor groups. There's a bit more to that, right? But most of the bad stuff that happens out there on the big bad internet can be distilled down to that number. It's not a lot, is it? Some of them are massive. Think about some of the nation states you'll be up against. You know, some of them literally have tens and tens of thousands of people in those hacking teams. They're pretty serious and very well funded, but they aren't ghosts, right? And so one of the things you can look at with your intelligence program is what I would describe as intelligence-led initiatives. Back to what I was talking about with those diagnostic measurements. How well do you understand your own specific threat landscape? So some rhetorical questions for you perhaps to take on board is, who are your top 5 threat actors? Like, who are they? You might not ever figure out who Gary67@gmail.com is or something like that, but we know a lot about threat actor groups, the behaviours they use, what they're buying and selling on the deep and dark web, which vulnerabilities they're exploiting, which phishing toolkits they're acquiring. We know a lot about that today. There's a lot more science than art in it. But what does that look like for you? And so imagine you've got this Venn diagram sort of paradigm. You've got the big bad threat landscape in one circle, and then you've got you in the other. How accurately can you quantify the intersection, right, between those two data sets? And this is what threat intelligence can start to do for you. Wouldn't it be good to know that you've got 28 vulnerabilities on 487 systems that directly leads to ransomware if you're a hospital, right? I'd want to know that. Think about what the decision that you would make next if you knew that today, what you would do tomorrow. I reckon you'd kill it. It would totally change your focus, right? And so these are the types of things that I think that can help. And I'm one of, if you ever listen to me talk or anything, I'm a big fan of having a bit more balance, because the cybersecurity industry is dominated by threat. And so it's a bit like, it's not a bad thing to detect and cut out skin cancer, right? We should be able to do that. Yeah, I'd agree. My problem is, we spend almost nothing on putting on a hat and sunscreen. And I kind of have this crazy assertion that, isn't it funny how much skin cancer you don't get when you put on a hat and sunscreen? This is what we're talking about here. There's a lot of work we can do proactively and preemptively that we tend not to value. This is one of the ways to get at that. I personally love this slide. This is great. Think about the pendulum. Do we spend a bit less on cybersecurity and eat up a bit more risk? Or are we a bit more risk averse and we want to spend a bit more time and money on cybersecurity? And you right here in this room arguably are some of the best people on planet Earth to answer that for your organisation. There's a bit of science in it. We've been talking about some of the data as well, but you know, you have a very good gut instinct when it comes to this. And so there isn't really a right answer. I think there's a good answer for you. And this is one of the things to think about. And so my tendency is always to be secure, right? I'm a security pest. I want guards, guns and gates and helicopters and airbags and ABS brakes on a shopping trolley, right? Why wouldn't you do that? That's safer. It's ridiculous though, isn't it? Right? And so, you know, this is a really good way to think about this. Here's a really confronting one to go and ask cybersecurity people if you want them to sort of flinch and look at you funny is, well, what would happen if we cut our cybersecurity spending by 10% next year? What would that look like? Well, what would it look like? It's a fair question, right? So this is a really good way to think about this in your own organisations. So this is where we get to negotiating a risk appetite. What does that look like? How far do we need to go in either direction before it becomes uncomfortable? And maybe that's a good way to feel that out, so to speak. If we're spending too much, it feels like we're spending too much. If we're spending too little, we're spending too little. Is there a Goldilocks zone in the middle that sort of hovers around a sort of a 5 to 10% range on what you're spending? Yeah, there probably is. And if you can find that, then guess what? That's a really good answer. And so these perceptions on risk appetites, this is one where I thought this one was, I was encouraged by this. It seems like CIOs and CISOs tend to have a pretty similar view on that this being, it's a practical tool to try and figure out a risk appetite. I'm not sure we agreed on what that actually means, but that's a good way to think about it. But when you see, this one here is interesting, is apparently for you CIOs, CISOs reckon you're not involved as much as you think you are. So whenever you see these delta changes, you can see what I mean, is these different perceptions on what they think you're doing. And so what does these protection targets look like? Here's an example of patching. You know, I was talking about the cohabitation problem before. You wouldn't want me to go and patch a system because I'd be an absolute menace. I'd patch everything until it breaks and celebrate the fact that I beat the SLA. Don't worry about you missing a payroll system or any of that because, you know, we got that security stuff nailed down. But what does that look like? This is all about having a productive discussion. How much does it cost me to patch things if we're vulnerable for 7 days? What if that cost a lot of money? Okay, well, let's run some other models and think about that. What if we had a patching cadence that looked something like this? What if we spent $1 million and we had a 30-day window? That might work out well. Now, you might say, oh, you're vulnerable for 30 days. My take on this is that no, you're not. Think of all the other compensating controls you have in your organisation, and patching is one of them. In cybersecurity, we talk about defence in depth a lot, except for this. This one drives me crazy. So you're telling me you've got web, email, firewall, endpoint, DLP, SIEM, SOAR, all these other things that do nothing for security, except we need to be 100% perfect on patching. So that's, to me, is a more productive way to think about that. We have these compensating controls. Each of you is probably going to have between 10 to maybe 15 plus compensating controls, and patching is just one of them. And that's where these protection sort of targets can come in, these protection level agreements. How can we decide what's sort of the Goldilocks zone, and let's build out from there. Balancing security with operations is another big one. How do we do third-party risks? And so I've spent a lot of years, like I wrote the first market guide for CAS. I've covered a lot of time covering SaaS security. And this is one of those areas that sort of, I get a giggle out of it because business units, arguably for one of the first times in IT history, can really empower themselves to procure their own IT. They can go and pick a SaaS application, insert the corporate credit card, and off you go. They don't really need us for anything. And so with these third-party risk and responsibilities, this one sort of really hit home because I've spent a lot of time covering SaaS security. And I've always had the view of, rather than say no as the security team, which could mean block someone accessing some kind of SaaS application, I think it's far more productive to say yes and here's how. If there's 5 options for a particular SaaS application category, what would be a good SaaS application? It would be one with good APIs that can retrieve logging and you can do policy insertion and all that sort of stuff. That's what I would like to see. And, you know, again, interesting survey results here is that CISOs believe that the business units need to be a lot more accountable versus CIOs sort of take the view that it's on us to have a look at that. I think, for example, here's a really rough rule of thumb. If you're spending money on SaaS, and let's say you spend $100 just to make the math easy, you should probably budget about 8 to 15% of that for securing it. And that would include identity and access management and security service edge and DLP and a whole range of other bits and pieces for that. But that's a good way to think about it, because for us in security, we don't tend to own the biggest budget. And it tends to be an uncomfortable conversation to go back mid-year and go, oops, we need more funding. And so as you're procuring IT in the business unit, it helps us a lot in cybersecurity to sort of budget that money in. Otherwise, we need to go back and hunt for that at the end of the year or the end of the next cycle. And if there's a gap between now and the end of the cycle, you could have unprotected, you know, SaaS applications and stuff like that. So these are some of the things. Again, I'm not a fan of boiling the ocean, but, you know, down to the individual BUs, if they want to procure some of their IT, that can be really great. I'm not anti that. I'm pro-user sort of a guy. But you'd still want to have some kind of way to think about, okay, the business units are doing some of this. You know, do we have MFA adoption in place? You know, we've got Log4j happening in a couple of different business units, right? What are we doing with that? Just to have something that sort of you can empower the business units to procure a lot of their IT, but that also comes along with, hey, we need to do a little bit of brand resilience there as well. So this is not a bad way to think about what that looks like. It's pretty easy to consume. You want to hand that and give that to the individual asset owners inside the organisation, just in terms of, you know, trying to get everyone on the same page at the same time. Here's another one around connecting cybersecurity with business outcomes. Okay, negotiating risk appetite and things like that. And so this is not a bad way to think about it. Now here's where I play. I'm the guy down in the weeds in the dots down here. I don't know, actually, if you're a hospital or you're a manufacturer or you're a government agency, what a ransomware outbreak would mean to your organisation in terms of cost. I don't know. I'm a security pest. I want to stop it, but in terms of this is why your roles are so critical, I don't know actually what that would look like. And so this is where we need this synergy of, you know, CIOs being actively involved in these types of decisions. Because I'm a technical pest. I really want to trace down vulnerabilities and, you know, make sure the compensating controls are configured and, you know, doing threat intelligence and all that sort of good stuff. But I don't actually know what the cost would be to a manufacturer to have 50% of your manufacturing machines go down, or a hospital, or you're a government agency doing social security or something. I don't know what that looks like. It's kind of above my pay grade. But these are all really good things to getting back to that graphic on, do we go low or do we go high in terms of your risk appetite? This is an area I think that CISOs, generally speaking, are really well suited to handle that very well. And what would that practically look like though? It's a nice motherhood statement, isn't it? But again, you want to break these things down if you can into component parts. So just like every industry vertical has a nuanced and different threat landscape, within your own organisation, you'll find that there are more parts of your business or organisation that are at risk versus others. And so, you know, if we broke it down like that in terms of high business value and lots of risk, what do all the different groups look like inside your organisation? Because you want to apply this with a little bit of methodical, you know, treatment on how much you deploy. So you don't want to overspend in one area and not in others. So this is the whole program, but you also want to bring that to life inside the subcomponents of your own business. And so here's some examples here, risk and value for ransomware. So you could start to look at, what does ransomware recovery look like for the different business units? How does that play out? Which areas do we need to spend the most amount of time on to get the most amount of risk abatement? And so this is another nice little way, simple way, back of the tea coaster way to try and figure this out systematically on how you're going to make that decision on where you sit between what your risk appetite looks like. I'll reduce a lot of risk, or I'll try and save a bit of money and invest that elsewhere. So this isn't a bad way to look at that. I like this because it's immediately actionable. I can go out and work on that. Right? As someone that's down lower in the dots, that would be a good mission for me. What are we doing about that? I can dig into that. That's something I could start work on Monday. All right. So in summary, you know, balancing protection with business needs, this is an age-old problem. I don't think AI might help, but, you know, AI coming along doesn't change a lot of these things. This seems to me like to be a universal type of question that's still going to be trying to be answering this, you know, decades from now. And so I think defensibility counts. Can you defend your spend? And so if you were spending $100 on cybersecurity today and you wanted to spend $200 tomorrow, okay, that sounds good, right? There's lots of new toys out there to go and buy. But what are you? Are you 5% more secure? 100%? Like what? Somewhere in the middle? And, you know, I heard this from a marketing person, so I think I'm okay to say it. It's sort of like in marketing, they have this funny concept of I spend $100 on marketing, $50 works, I just don't know which 50, right? Cybersecurity can be a little bit like that. And, you know, being able to be a bit hard-nosed and say, if we did this, what would a winning result look like to justify that additional spend? Things like regulations are kind of really important, but I think tying this to outcomes is where you really want to be. And I've spent a lot of time working out how I can do a better job for you as a CIO on reporting to someone like a board on what your threat landscape actually looks like. So, for example, one of the things it's eaten away at me, I got a question about 7 years ago at this exact event, and it was kind of like, it was a CIO and he said, hey Craig, how do I figure out if I'm vulnerable to ransomware? It's a really simple question, a fair one, and also profound from my point of view, because I would say, well, we've got a SIEM, we've got a fancy new XDR, we're doing all these things, you know, 4 of our products are even in Gartner's top right, yes. You know, surely this time we've got it, but what does that mean? That's not an answer to the question, is it? What I want to give you is a much better answer. And a much better answer would be something like this. We've got 5 threat actors exploiting 87 vulnerabilities, 27 of which we have on 487 systems, and there's 3 valid attack paths to get to those systems, of which each one of them we've got at least 6 compensating controls deployed. Right? That's an answer, isn't it? And you could track that over time and say, hey, 60 days ago we had 27 vulnerabilities with 3 valid attack paths for ransomware, now we've got 8. And see the delta between the two? That, to me, again, from a bottom-up type of guy, is what ROI starts to look like. Notice I didn't use any 3-letter technical acronyms or anything like that to describe that. I think they're the types of things that people like us need to do to help people like you to communicate with a board about what cybersecurity risk looks like and what an appetite should even be. All right. Thank you very much for coming along to my session. Thank you.